I'm here today to try and share with you a little bit the hidden powers of questions and my not-so-secret life for them. So, let me ask you a question. Or rather, you know what, I'll save that question for the end of my talk. But most people, when they hear the words, "let me ask you a question," lean forward, open their ears, and get ready. So without even the question, just the promise of a question already has that power. The power to get us focused on the here and now. And that's the first hidden power I'd like to share with you today. And I want to explain also a little bit of why questions are so important in communication. Communication between people, in communications theory, basically says there are two overarching objectives. To learn something about someone, or to learn something about something. And it turns out that questions do both very well. They help us in the liking process, and they help us in the learning process. So, what exactly is a question? All right, without getting into a textbook definition, I'm just going to paraphrase Edgar Schein, an author, who's written quite extensively and thought extensively about the whole notion of the question of questions. All right, and he says a true question is just authentically wanting to know somebody else's opinion about something. He kind of compares it to fertile ground. Fertile ground is willing and able to accept rain and humidity. And a humble mind is able to accept other people's ideas effectively. But I have a confession to make. Despite my love for questions, I'm actually a recovering answerholic. It started very early, back to elementary school actually, and we had these morning quizzes on current events at school, and I just couldn't deal with the fact of not knowing every answer. So my response was to go home, and every day I would read the newspaper cover to cover. And very soon I knew all the answers, and the other kids started calling me encyclopedia. And I was basking in the serotonin glory of the right answer. It was amazing. My first step towards recovery from this addiction happened many years later, but actually many years earlier than I would have liked. My father was diagnosed with incurable cancer and was just given a few months to live. And I just couldn't get my head around that, couldn't come to terms with it. So my answer was to start searching for answers. There was no Google at the time, so instead I ran around to see doctors and specialists and try to find as many answers as I could. What happened? I came back to my father and I tried to give him back all of this information in kind of a frenzied manner, and at one point he just stops me in mid-sentence, puts a hand on my shoulder, looks me straight in the eyes and says, "Alon, a man is going to die. You better start asking the right questions now, because there is no later." As you can imagine, those words still echo quite a bit in my mind. And just to lighten up the ambiance a little bit, a very strange thing happened to me just recently. At the business school where I'm dean, we had a strategy workshop. And the whole team came up with an idea that we were facing the imminent disruption of higher education in general, and of business schools more specifically. And the facilitator of this workshop, when he kind of restituted the findings, he summarized it as, if the business school doesn't start asking the right questions now, there will be no later. WTF. Very eerie coincidence, but I got the message. So what's so special about questions? You know, the thing is, learning through questions, something we think about in education, is nothing new. You know, the Socratic method is at least 2,500 years old. And even all of the new pedagogical innovations we hear about today, basically it's a rehashed version of the Socratic method. If it's inverted classrooms, if it's project-based learning, problem-based learning, whatever it may be, it's still just learning by asking questions. All right? And so that's not really changed. So that's definitely not specialty. It's not the novelty that's special. But there is something special about questions, and I believe that questions have been behind all of the progress we have made in humankind since the dawn of time. Maybe the most important question of humanity is just one simple question, one that has helped ensure our survival as a species and make sure we were able to populate the planet, and that is your place or mine. Mi casa, su casa, voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir? There are lots of versions. Simple, effective, maybe more effective for some than for others, but already a first question. And where would we be without questions and humor? Think about all of the jokes that start with the question. Why did the chicken cross the road? Maybe the most famous of all. And there are other questions like, the kids love knock knock, who's there? Or, as an homage to Charles that just spoke, what do you call a fish with no eyes? You want to know? It's a fish. All right, so maybe we can move on to something more serious, and that's science. All right, we heard about Einstein earlier, and Einstein, a master questioner. All of modern physics, all of the theory of relativity, is thanks to a thought experiment that Einstein did. Was, I wonder what the world would look like for someone surfing on a beam of light. And when asked by a journalist, what is the source of your genius? He said, I'm not a genius. I'm not smarter than anybody else. I just ask better questions. So, as adults, we have the answer mindset. Kids, on the other hand, have the question mindset. We have an epidemic of certainty. We think we know more than we know, and we think we understand what we need to understand, and we think we see things as they really are. Kids, on the other hand, come in with fresh eyes and they ask why. And when you answer them, they ask why again, and again, and again, and again, just because. Okay? Google it. But more seriously, the reason why they frustrate us with these questions is because they're so good at asking naive questions. They just want to gain understanding and clarity as simply as possible. And right away, very quickly, we realize, you know what? We don't understand things that well to be able to explain them simply. And that frustrates us. The other thing that kids are very good at doing is seeing things with fresh eyes. I think you all know the notion of déjà vu, that feeling of being somewhere for the first time, but somehow it seems familiar. Well, there's also a notion called vujade, which is seeing something familiar, but seeing it as if it was for the first time. Now, kids are very good at doing that, but we're not so good at doing that. And the question is, how have we as adults lost that ability? And when did that happen? So one clue is in the slide that I'm about to show you. And this is basically the propensity of kids to ask questions in class. At nursery school, it's nearly everyone. By the time we finish high school, it's less than 1 in 4. All right? And it gets worse. Engagement drops in step with questions. Now, in terms of causality, it's hard to say, do questions fall because we're less engaged, or does engagement fall because we're asking less questions? But in either case, I think you'll agree that it's not very encouraging. And we saw earlier that curiosity follows a similar path. So what explains our addiction to questions? So I don't know if you know, there's a wonderful book called Illusions by Richard Bach, where he tells a story, which I've adapted quite a bit. The story of a colony of fleas in the middle of a raging river. And that's their life. And at one point, one of the fleas says, there has to be more. This can't be all that life has to offer. What if we just let go? Can't we just trust the river to take us to a better destination? When he suggested this to his friends, they all laughed at him. Some of them called him crazy. Some said, you're going to die. But he said, I've got to go see what's out there. And he let go. And so he bumped along on the river for quite a bit until the first turn in the river, he was ejected from the water and landed on the banks of the river. Very soon, the sun dried him off, and he discovered he had wings. He was so excited. He flew right back to the colony of the rock, and he said, "Guys, it's me. You just have to let go." And the other fleas saw him, and they said, "Oh God, it's the Messiah. Look, it's the Messiah. Please help us." And they all tried to grab the flea and bring him back down onto the rock. All right. This fable reminds me all the time of the difference between the question mindset and the answer mindset. The openness to experience is the ability to embrace change, rather than embracing the rock ever more tightly. So, asking questions can be a lot simpler than we think. All right? 4 words. What do you think? That's all we have to ask. This is true, humble inquiry in spirit and in action. Really wanting to authentically know what somebody else thinks about a subject. And it's not very complicated. It's just 4 words. And it turns out that it's also the key to the art of listening. You ask the question, and you shut up when the answer is told. That's it. All right? But there's even simpler. 2 words. What if? What if there are 2 magic words that unlock our imagination? They allow us to get unshackled from our constraints, real or imagined, and they allow us to do wonderful things. Think about how much progress science has made through what-if questions. Copernicus asking, what if it's the Earth that revolves around the sun rather than vice versa? Changed our understanding of the universe and our place in the universe. How many people have changed their lives just by asking, what if? What if is what sparks innovation and what expands our imagination. 2 words. But I have to warn you, together with these true questions of humble inquiry, there's a lot of false questions out there as well. What I call questions in disguise. They look like questions, but they're actually something very different. Kind of sheep in wolf's clothing, if you will. You know, when my wife asks me, "Are you really going to wear that tonight?" It's probably more of a recommendation to go get changed than a true question. Or when somebody's boss says, "How can you explain your poor job performance?" It sounds more like a judgment than a question. And then there's the annoying questions like, "Didn't I tell you so?" Which is basically telling and not asking. Now, then there are these rhetorical questions that don't even pretend to want an answer. And then there are the big questions, the questions that don't even have a question mark, yet they're still famous. To be or not to be, that is the question. There is no question mark. So it's not even a question in our sense of the word. But Shakespeare, probably better than anybody else, has understood the power of a question to change our perception of people, situation, and things. To be or not to be, the burning existential questions that have no easy answers. Is there a God? Is there life after death? Do we have a soul? Is there free will? And then there's the granddaddy of all existential questions. What is the meaning of life? All right, this question has been asked all through the times. Philosophers and princes, thinkers, laymen have been asking this question. And even Douglas Adams made it a central part of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, for those who read that. All right? And I recently came across this cover on the magazine of New Philosopher, which reminds us that the question is still in vogue. And nobody's been able to answer that question until today. And I'm going to share with you the answer to this question. The biggest question of all time. The answer is a question. The answer is a question. The most hidden, potent power of questions has been hiding in plain sight. We've been saying the answer while we're asking the question and we didn't even realize it. Once you move the question mark, you realize that it is the questions that we ask that give meaning to our lives. Change the questions, change your life. It's very beautiful, and it's very simple, and it's very powerful. It's not the finding of the answers. It's the seeking of the questions that give meaning to our lives. And what's true for us as individuals is true for us as a society, for our institutions, for our companies, for our children. And if you'll allow me to paraphrase Martin Luther King, I too have a dream. I dream that my children will not only be judged by the content of their character, but also by the quality of their questions. And as an educator of business women and men from around the world, I hope that we as a business school can inspire these future leaders to ask the meaningful questions that will inspire change. And so I promised you a question, and my big question to you today is, now that you know that the time to start asking questions is now, that you have to let go of the rock of answers. You know a little bit about the power of questions, and you know that to change your life, you just need to change your questions. So my question to you is, what questions will you start asking now to yourself and to others in order to spark the change? Thank you.